They did not disappear. They were erased. And that changes everything. You were told they were myths, stories, religious imagination from people who did not understand the world. But what if that is not true? What if the people who wrote those texts were not primitive at all? What if they were witnesses? Because 6,000 years ago, something appeared on Earth. Not slowly, not gradually, all at once. A civilization with writing, with laws, with mathematics, with astronomy, already complete. No evolution, no development. They simply arrived, already knowing. And they left behind records, clear records, explaining exactly where that knowledge came from. But those records are disappearing. In April 2003, 15,000 ancient artifacts vanished from the National Museum in Baghdad. Not gold, not statues, texts, the oldest written records on Earth, taken by people with radios, people who moved in organized groups, people who walked past priceless treasures and took only one thing: information. So ask yourself one question. Why would anyone steal information instead of treasure? Unless that information was more valuable than gold and more dangerous. That question has an answer, and by the end of this, you will understand exactly why those tablets needed to disappear. Now, let us start from the beginning. The Sumerians appeared in what is now southern Iraq around 6,000 years ago, and from the very first moment, something is wrong with their story. Every other civilization on Earth shows development, gradual progress. Stone tools become metal, simple marks become writing, villages become cities. This process takes thousands of years, every time, without exception. Except once. The Sumerians had writing from the beginning. Not simple symbols, a full, complex system, capable of recording law, poetry, mathematics, history. They had agriculture, a legal code, schools, a postal system, trade routes, standardized weights, and a knowledge of astronomy so precise that modern science is still catching up to it. There was no learning curve. That is not how civilizations work. That has never been how civilizations work. Except here, one time, in one place, 6,000 years ago. And the Sumerians themselves were very clear about why. They said they did not develop this knowledge. They said it was given to them by the Anunnaki. Now stop, because this is where most people make a mistake. They hear that word and they think religion, they think mythology, they think primitive people inventing supernatural explanations for things they did not understand. But that is not what the Sumerians wrote. Read the actual texts. The Anunnaki are not described as spiritual forces. They are not described as abstract gods. They are described as physical beings, with names, with ranks, with specific responsibilities, with arguments and conflicts and relationships. They eat, they sleep, they get angry, they make decisions. And the name itself, Anunnaki, it translates directly, those who came from the heavens to earth. Not those who live in heaven, not those who created heaven, those who came from heaven. To earth. The movement is in the name. And then they did something that changes how you understand every ancient civilization that came after. They created us. The Enuma Elish is one of the oldest texts ever discovered. It describes the creation of human beings, and the language it uses does not sound like mythology. It sounds like a process. Words like mix, combine, form, complete, a step-by-step procedure, with a stated purpose. Humans were created to perform labor that other beings no longer wanted to do. Before humans, according to the Sumerians, there were the Igigi, workers. They maintained the earth, they mined, they built, they farmed. But the Igigi rebelled, they stopped working. And so the Anunnaki made a decision. They would create something new, something adapted to Earth's conditions, something obedient, something that would not remember enough to cause problems. And that something was you. Now, here is where it gets uncomfortable. Modern science has a problem, a quiet problem, one that researchers discuss carefully. Human DNA contains what geneticists call an acceleration event, a period in the relatively recent past where human genetic complexity jumped, dramatically, far faster than gradual evolution explained. The gap between human cognition and the cognition of our closest animal relatives is, by the standards of evolutionary biology, almost impossible to account for naturally. Scientists know this. They have known it for years, and they do not have a clean answer for it. The Sumerians did, but the story does not stop with creation, because the same texts that describe our origin also describe what came next. And what came next is the part that has been hidden most carefully. The Epic of Atrahasis is another ancient Sumerian text, and it records something disturbing. At a certain point, humanity had grown too large, too loud, too active. The text says the noise of humans disturbed the gods. But here is what scholars rarely mention. The original word translated as noise does not just mean sound. It means disturbance, activity, loss of control. Humanity was getting out of control, and the response was systematic. First came disease, then famine, then something larger, something that ended an entire era of history in a single event, the flood. Now, you have heard the flood story before. Noah, the ark, rain for 40 days. But here is what you were not told. The flood appears in over 250 ancient cultures worldwide. 250. Cultures that had no contact with each other, separated by oceans, by continents, by thousands of years. And in almost every version, the structure is the same. A warning is given to one person. That person builds a vessel, survives, begins human history again after the catastrophe. That is not a coincidence. That is a memory. In the Sumerian version, the survivor is called Ziusudra. He receives a warning. He builds a vessel. He survives. And afterward, he is given something remarkable. The text says, he was granted life like that of the gods. What does that mean exactly? Look at the Sumerian king list, a clay tablet listing rulers of ancient cities, 140 names. For each ruler, a length of reign. And for the earliest kings, the ones who ruled before the flood, the numbers are not decades, they are not centuries. One king ruled for 36,000 years, another for 28,000. The standard response is to call this symbolic, religious exaggeration. But wait, the kings who ruled after the flood have completely normal reign lengths, decades, sometimes centuries, historically plausible numbers. If the whole document was symbolic, why are only the early numbers impossible? Unless the early rulers were not human, unless their biology was simply different. The biblical tradition says the same thing through a different door. Before the flood, people lived for hundreds of years. Methuselah lives 969 years. After the flood, lifespans collapse. Within a few generations, humans live and die in the time frames we recognize today. Two separate traditions, the same pattern, the same turning point, the same dramatic reduction at the same moment in history. Something changed at the flood. Something biological. Something fundamental. And now look at the physical evidence. Because this is where the story stops being ancient history and starts being something you can touch. In Iraq, archaeologists have found ancient mines. Not rough, primitive digs, organized extraction sites, with tunnel systems, passage networks, structured operations. Dated to periods when, according to official history, humans in the region could barely organize permanent settlements. Someone was running industrial mining operations before civilization should have existed. The Sumerian texts name the resource they were extracting: gold. The texts are specific. The Anunnaki came to this planet with a purpose: resource extraction. And the labor force they created was designed for exactly that work. The oldest known gold mines on Earth are in southern Africa. They have been dated to periods that align with the timelines recorded in the Sumerian king list. Someone was mining there too, systematically, on a large scale. long before any known civilization existed in that region. An organized mining operation requires management. Management requires a record system. A record system requires writing, laws to control the workers, administration, hierarchy. Everything the Sumerians appeared with, fully formed from the very beginning. It is not a mystery if you know what you are looking at. It is a supply chain.
But here is what nobody talks about.
The beings at the top of that chain left traces, physical traces, in the bodies of the people around them. In the tomb of the Sumerian queen Puabi, discovered in 1927, something unusual was documented quietly. Her skull was different, more elongated, with bone structure outside the normal range for the local population. That single detail would mean nothing on its own, but it is not on its own. In Egypt, elongated skulls were documented throughout the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten. He was the ruler who, suddenly, without precedent, dismantled the entire Egyptian religious system and declared one god, a god of light. He is shown in art with an elongated skull, a narrow face, unusually long limbs. His wife and children are depicted the same way, and after his death, his successors erased him from history with a thoroughness that was almost violent. Smashed statues, removed names, destroyed images. Why work so hard to erase someone unless what he represented was genuinely dangerous? In South America, more than 300 elongated skulls have been recovered, and some of them are not just a different shape, they have a larger internal volume, up to 25% larger than a standard human skull. This is the detail that matters, because artificial skull deformation, the standard academic explanation, changes shape. It does not change volume. You cannot compress a skull and end up with more interior space.
The physics do not work.
Some of these skulls grew differently from the beginning. And in 2016, DNA testing on several of these skulls returned results that researchers called anomalous. Mitochondrial sequences that could not be matched to any known human population. Markers with no identified human origin. The findings were published, and then the conversation stopped. No follow-up studies, no further testing, no explanation, just silence. Think about what that silence means. Now bring everything together. Slow down and feel the weight of this. Texts from 6,000 years ago describing beings who arrived from the sky and engineered humanity for a specific purpose. A civilization that appeared fully formed with no developmental period. Industrial mining operations thousands of years before they should have existed. Physical remains showing anatomy that does not match standard human biology. DNA with sequences that have no human origin. And a pattern, the same pattern, repeated in cultures across every continent that had no contact with each other. And then, in April 2003, during a military invasion, in the chaos of a falling government, someone organized a precise, targeted removal of the oldest written records on Earth. Not gold, not art, not anything with monetary value, the texts. At what point does the word coincidence stop working? Now look at the present, because this is where it becomes personal.
Almost every tradition that records the Anunnaki, or their equivalents in other cultures, records the same final detail. They did not simply leave, they left with a promise to return. The cycle is written into the mythology itself. They come, they intervene, they depart, they return. Every culture that recorded their arrival also recorded their departure as temporary. The Sumerian texts reference a celestial body moving on a long cycle, a body that comes close to Earth periodically. Astronomers have been tracking unexplained gravitational effects in the outer solar system for decades. Objects in the outer regions of our solar system behave as if something large is influencing their orbits. The search for what is causing it is ongoing, and officially unresolved. The Sumerians said their visitors had a point of origin that moved, something on a long elliptical path, something that comes close, then moves away, then comes close again. Look at human history through that lens. For long stretches, almost nothing changes. And then, suddenly, a leap. Knowledge appears from nowhere. Architecture achieves things that should be impossible. An understanding of astronomy, mathematics, or medicine arrives in a culture with no apparent means of developing it independently. And sometimes, after that leap, the civilization collapses, and the cycle begins again. Agriculture, writing, cities, laws. Every foundational element of human civilization appeared in a window of time that, in the scale of 200,000 years of human existence on this planet, is almost instantaneous. After 200,000 years of stone tools, civilization exploded into existence in what amounts to a single moment. The Sumerians knew why. They wrote it down. And someone has been working very hard, for a very long time, to make sure that writing never reaches you. Here is the question that should stay with you. If the cycle is real, if the pattern is real, if beings came before and left with a promise to return, then the question is not whether they existed. The question is where we are in the cycle right now. You are sending signals into space, hoping for a response. Billions of dollars, decades of effort, pointed at distant stars. But what if the answer is not coming from deep space? What if the distance is much shorter than that? What if the reason your own DNA contains sequences with no identified human origin is that the modification is not ancient history? What if it is still active? The last time humanity started asking the right questions, the records were removed. In 3 days, by organized teams, with radios, who knew exactly where to go and exactly what to take. That is not the chaos of war, that is management. And the thing about a managed population is this: you do not erase information to protect the past. You erase information to control the future. The real question is not who the Anunnaki were. The real question is who decided you were not allowed to know. Think about that. Because the Sumerians were not primitive people inventing stories about things they did not understand. They were recording something they had seen. There is a difference, and that difference is everything.